Good afternoon and welcome to the State Library of Victoria and welcome to the latest in our online collections webinar series. I'm Andrew and I'm here with Jane. We're librarians with the Digital Access and Family History team, and today, as possibly you can see from our regalia and our backgrounds, we're talking footy. So we welcome your questions. You can ask us questions via the Slido forum, which you can see on your screen. Or if you're using a second device, you can go to slido.com and put in our online collections as the event code, and you can see that displayed on your screen as well. So with the football recommencing tonight, after such a long lockdown, we thought it might be an opportune moment to talk a little bit about football research. And football research can inform a broad range of topics beyond football. It comes into any histories of towns or regions, any histories of the development of Melbourne society and family history and various other ways. And it is an integral part of the social history of our state. Some of the football teams in Victoria are amongst the oldest of any code. And the Victorian Football Association was one of the first leagues established anywhere in the world. So it's always been incredibly popular, even back as far as 1908. The grand final was attended by about 10% of Melbourne's population. So to put that in today's context, that's 500,000 people. So they'd fit 5 times, you'd need 5 MCGs to fit them. So love it or hate it, football is a part of Melbourne and Victoria's popular culture. And we do have an Australian rules football guide, which I'll show you now. So that guide is one of many guides we have. And to get to our guides, under Search and Discover, that's where most of our research tools are. And you can see under Our Collections, you've got research guides, or under research tools, the link goes to the same place, research guides. So yeah, we have about 75 research guides. And the idea of those is that they identify the best sources for that particular topic. And they give you advice about how to get the best out of those sources. And we also focus as much as we can on online sources as well. So there's the Australian Rules Football Guide. And you'll see you've got various tabs there. So all of those are reasonably self-explanatory, and we'll be covering a lot of the content within the guide today. One of the things that you might be interested in is if you haven't got a good handle on football history, if you go to the timeline, that'll take you through some of the major events in the development of football. The other thing that's of interest is that we have a page that we created during the lockdown, which we thought might substitute a little bit for there being no football. And we researched some great games in the past, particularly beyond living memory. And that was a really interesting process. And what we discovered was that you can really get a feel for the game, even from that long ago, through the newspapers, through photographs. And Joan will be talking more about those resources very shortly. I think the other thing that we discovered was in each of those games that there were stories and connections that took us beyond the game. And sometimes those stories around footballers took us back to their life and their times. And one of my favourite images at the library relating to football is this image here, beautiful image of captains of the VFA football teams back in the early 1880s. And the chap in the centre is George Coulthard, who was arguably the best player of the 19th century, a dominant player in the late 1870s and early 1880s. And George also played a test match for Australia and actually umpired some test matches. So he was an outstanding sportsman and to a great extent had the world at his feet. But sometimes football's great triumphs collide with life, and life isn't always fair. And that happened in George's case and his family. His father died when he was 10. His mum died when he was 17. The family was George and 6 siblings, and only one of the siblings lived beyond 30. So George himself, who looked so athletic here, streaking away from a Geelong player, passed away when he was only 27. So it's really a case of starting with a sporting career, but ending up with an understanding of a bit more about how hard and sad life could be in the late 19th century. So to take us on a bit of a journey through researching through our catalogue, I'll just handball across to Jane.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, I'm going to give you a few starting points for your football research. And one thing I'll remind you of is that to look at a lot of our online material, you need to have a Victorian membership Now, I'm not seeing my screen. So up on the top right-hand side of the page is a membership, link to membership for you to sign up. So I'll start the search with Victorian Football League, and I'm choosing the articles tab. So we'll run that search, and here we have 120 or so articles covering all aspects of the game, including sports history, nutrition, economics, and football in wartime. If this particular search excludes news articles, so if you're interested in any news articles, you'd need to click on this link here, and that will run the search across in the news article tab. And here you can see we've got nearly 10,000 results. And these papers include major dailies, as well as regional and local papers, such as the Moonee Valley Leader and the Bendigo Advertiser. And as you can see from down the side here, you can limit to either particular publication title or by date and subject. Next, I'll show you a larger catalogue search. So here we're choosing from this list the top option, everything except articles, and I'm going to do my search on the Essendon Football Club. So clicking on that list, we've got over 200 items in that search, and this pulls up material both by and about the club. So we've got all their magazines, club histories that they've written over the years, the football club song, and we've also got a significant number of pictures about the Essendon Football Club. And I'll just highlight two of these. The first is the Rennie Ellis collection. Now, the library has an archive of thousands of photographs taken by photographer Rennie Ellis of Victoria's social and public life, Victorians at play, if you like. And his photographs cover the period, the 1970 up to about 1996. So that you can see there's over 120 photos taken by Rennie Ellis, and that will include some from the glory days of Essendon, those 1980s grand finals. Another important image collection we've got is Charles Edward Boyle's. And Charles was a photographer who travelled around Victoria 1925 to 1965, and he took photographs of, amongst many other things, football teams, which included grandstands and also individual players. So most of these images we'd been able to identify at this level, but some of them, there was no information on them identifying the club or any of the players involved. And there's a lot of help we've received from Ken Mansell, and he's gone through and added his user comments to most of the Boyle's records. In fact, he's written a book about the State Library's collection of Boyle photographs. And when you do a search, you will still pick up these user comments. You can see the highlight there of Essendon Football Club in the catalogue record. So if you're interested, if you've come across any of the images that we've put up there and you know something that we don't, you can just sign in with your membership and add to this user comments field. And as you can see, that's really a valuable thing to have. Boyle's also has there's a website that Ken Mansell has largely contributed to as well, which includes his collections held by us and also club historical collections, and there's information on football cards over various years, an A to Z of players, and there's also a lot of essays and fabulous information to explore all about football in Victoria, and also highlighting Boyle's photographs. Another fabulous resource is this Reading Australian Rules Football, the definitive guide to the game, edited by Tim Hogan. And that the cover there is one of Rennie Ellis's photographs from the 1984 Essendon Grand Final. In this, there's over 2,000 items described for interest for students of the game. It includes biographies and club information, as well as the Indigenous contribution to the game, women in football, and also art, literature and music and football. So that's a fabulous resource to explore. So thanks a lot, Andrew. I'll hand back to you now.
Thank you very much, Jane. So now we're going to talk a little bit about websites. And I'll just go back to our website here, and there's George Coulter, but we're going to jump back into our research guide. So one of the things that has happened over the last probably 15, 20 years is that there's been a real explosion in research in a lot of areas, but into football. And a lot of that's been driven by the internet. So that's to do with the availability of resources. And Jane's spoken a bit about that, and she'll speak in a moment about newspapers and other images. And they do give people access in a way that they didn't have before to a vast amount of information. It's also drawn together people who are researchers and who are interested in football, who may not have known each other, but the internet connects them, and they can also present their research online. So it does mean that there's a huge amount of data available now that hadn't previously been available. One of my favourite sites, and a great site for statistics, is this AFL tables. It goes back to the start of the VFA in 1897 and has all the match scores with all the teams. So one of our great grand finals we had was 1909. Unfortunately, Carlton lost that one, but anyways, we'll have a look at the match stats. Now, they're not match stats as we know them now, and that's probably not a terrible thing, is it? Because the game's been taken over by statistics. But if you look at one player, this chap here, Arthur Potty Hiskins, was an interesting player, debuted that year and was in the premiership side. His career went up until he was 37. You'll see there that in 1912, they started to wear numbers. But also, he had a break in his career from 1915, halfway through the season, to 1919. He was one of four brothers who played VFL football, and three of them, including Arthur, went off to the First World War. So that's why we don't see him at that period. But yeah, just an enormous amount of detail on this site for the entire history of the VFL and AFL. Another really good one is this Australian football site, and that covers a huge amount of information as well. It has a lot of articles, historic articles. It also has enormous amount of detail and biographies of players. So I'm looking for a player named Norm Clark, who played in that 1909 grand final as well. Outstanding sportsman, a Stall gift winner, a great player at North Adelaide and a great player at Carlton, three-time premiership player and two-time premiership coach. But one of the most distinctive things about him was that he had a fantastic nickname. He was named Hackenschmidt after an Estonian bodybuilder called Georg Hackenschmidt, who was genuinely world famous and had toured Australia and played at the Melbourne Opera House back in the end of 1904. And the Carlton players thought that Norm Clark had a physique not dissimilar to Georg Hackenschmidt, so that's how he acquired that nickname. If we have a look at another site here, the Footy Jumpers site, and I'm going to go to that one, and then I'm going to go back and just show you something on our great games that we noticed. So one of the things about a 1909 grand final, the reason we featured it is because there's fantastic footage of that particular game. So it gives us real insight into how people behaved at the game and how they dressed, etc. But if we have a look here, you'll see the Carlton team not quite running out in the ground, but they have a bit of a leisurely stroll onto the ground. And quite remarkably, for a grand final, they're wearing different jumpers. So half the players are in the old style jumper and half the players are in the new style jumper. So while the game was becoming more professional at that stage, it wasn't completely professional. And we'll have a look here at this footyjumpers.com site. We can double check that and see that, yep, they wore this jumper up to 1913 and they wore this jumper from 1909. So clearly they had a bit of a mix of jumpers for a couple of years. So let's go back to our website. So I'd recommend that 1909 grand final page. Have a look at that film. It's fantastic. It really is a great insight into the game all those years ago. And some of the play looks like it hasn't changed quite that much. So we tend to take the umpires for granted a bit, but they've always been part of the game and a very important part of the game. And this site here is just an amazing site. The ex-umpires have done an enormous amount of research into umpiring, and they've just collected a vast amount of statistics and information. One of the ones I like is player umpires, and there have been quite a few of those. This chap, that you might see a little image of there, Vic Belcher. He was very interesting. He was a great player for South Melbourne. And he has, I think, probably the unique distinction of having played in premiership sides for South Melbourne, having coached a premiership side with Fitzroy, but having also ran the boundary in a grand final. So that's a pretty good hat trick there. I can't imagine anybody else has ever done that. Moving down, another really good site is this Mongraal Punch site. So that one, apart from having a fantastic name, and they've got a terrific logo as well, that's a site that really looks at the game currently, primarily about articles about the game as it is today. And the articles are great collections of analytical and entertaining articles. And as I say, there's quite thoughtful and intelligent analysis of the game that perhaps we don't get as much of in the mainstream media as we would like. And the final one, there's other sites here that are worth looking at, but the final one I'll mention is AFLpedia, and that's a site that has been discontinued. But what has saved it has been this wonderful program that the National and State Libraries instituted way back in 1996 to archive old websites that would otherwise disappear. We all know that the internet is a fairly ephemeral entity and things come and go. But fortunately, through this Pandora program that's now on Trove, a lot of those old sites are retained, and even though they may not be added to, the content they have can be very valuable. So let's go for Q because there won't be many teams here, but it does cover country football in enormous detail. So there's Quambatook from up in the Mallee, and it tells you what particular leagues they played for, and it tells you that they've won premierships in particular leagues. So if we have a look at, say, the Witchy-Proof League way back then, gives you a timeline and what teams participated. So again, that's a pretty interesting site, I think, and one worth looking at. So the other old favourite is Wikipedia. Wikipedia has an enormous amount of content and it has a lot of VFL and AFL coverage. And the beauty of that is that anybody can go on there, and if you can improve an entry there, please do, because that's the beauty of Wikipedia, is it's about a collective group of people making things better. Okay, so back to Jane to talk us through some newspapers and some other interesting research tips.
Thank you, Andrew. Right. Another vital piece of football information and record is the football record. And we've got a set digitised from 1912 onwards. And to show you as an example, I'm going to go to the 1944 Grand Final football record. Here we go, football record. And throughout the season, the fixtures there and the results from each game as the season progresses. There's also articles, lists of players, and the other fascinating thing at this time are the advertisements that appeared within the football record. So that's a great thing to just be able to flip through. The game that I chose to do in the great games you might have missed was the 1944 Grand Final. And so we'll just go through now to the football record from that year, from that game. And you can see the cover there. September 30th, 1944. And just one thing I noticed reading through, it was an article written by a contributor called wait a minute, where is he? Today and Yesterday. And he laments, has the pace of the game increased to such an extent that players now have little opportunity of balancing and setting themselves to correctly handle and dispose of the ball? Well, I think we sort of lament that still today, really. So it's interesting that they've been thinking about the game in those terms for a very long time. Probably the best way to look through the football records is by choosing this thumbnail option, and then you can get an idea about what's on each page. So there you can see articles, advertisements, and then the teams. So another fabulous resource for researching football is Trove. And this is a database of holdings around all Australian libraries and also includes an increasing amount of online material. So our particular interest is this digitised newspapers section. So we'll do the search and then you can see it brings things back across all the different categories, and we'll go down to newspapers. And we can see this search gets us 67,000 items. It's probably almost enough. And as we're interested in the grand final from 1944, probably the most useful limiting you can use is the decade. So here we can drill down to 1940, again 1944, and then the month, September. And as we saw, the grand final that year was 30th September. So September and October are probably both worth looking at, definitely worth looking at, in fact. So September will bring us the lead up games as well as the grand final preview. And the other thing about the game at this time was that it was the closing years or months of the Second World War. So you really get a sense of the life that people were living as the closing battles and struggles of the Second World War were reported. In the wedding photos, for example, a lot of the people who are in service uniforms took recipes and things like that in the paper about using rations, and you just do get a sense of the much wider world that football is happening in. And there's not that much reportage either, really, just things on the back pages. Sporting Globe is probably a very good place to go, which is one of the papers included in this, to find articles on the game. And here, the Sporting Globe there comes up first with 31 results. The other thing is to look for the number of words in the article, which will give you a bit of a clue as to whether you're going to get a lot of information or not. And again, with Trove, you can sign up for a user account and do text corrections, because sometimes the character recognition is not that fantastic. So that's another great way to contribute to this wonderful resource. So I'll hand back to Andrew.
Thank you very much, Jane. So we have got a few questions there. What we might do is, just before we get to those questions, we had a newsletter and information went out that had, within that information was a couple of questions. One was about the jumper in 1909, which we've already talked about that. The other one was another one of the great games in 1929. It was actually the preliminary final, and we had a question there about who got the most free kicks, which is a sort of an unusual question. And it's mainly because, as I said before, statistically, the sort of statistics that they keep now obviously very limited back in those days. But they did sometimes have odd statistics would turn up. Sometimes they'd have exactly when people had kick goals, like, who kicked the goals and whether it was a snapshot or whatever. But there's no consistency to that. But I just thought it was funny that in this 1929 preliminary final, a very hard-fought match between Carlton and Richmond, that the Tigers won by 6 points. There was certainly an extraordinary number of free kicks, and obviously the out-of-bounds rule was very assiduously umpired by the umpire of the day. But it does tell us who got the most free kicks. So I think it was Bill Benton for Richmond got 9. The interesting one is for Carlton, Tommy Downs got 9. So it sort of indicates how impartial the umpires were, because Tommy was also reported twice that day. So he has the distinction of being one of the shortest players ever to play, 5'2", but possibly one of the feistiest, because he actually was suspended for more games than he played. I think he played 58 games and was suspended for 60 games. So let's now go back and have a look and see what questions we have there. I think, Jane, there was one there about doing research into the Victorian Amateur Football Association from 1953. Did you have some advice on that one?
Yes, I think, well, first stop is the catalogue to see what things we might have published by the association. Trove would also be a very good spot to look in, as luckily 1953 just sneaks in before copyright restricts a lot of coverage to before 1955. So we could certainly start there. And then once you've got the names of individual clubs, we can look for them on the catalogue. Also using those news articles databases. That's another avenue to pursue. So I'm sure we could certainly find things to help you get started.
Okay, thanks very much, Jane. And we do have another one about match day programs for Victorian country leagues. Look, that's an interesting one. In general, our library should receive a copy of everything published in Victoria. In practice, we try to do that as much as possible, but sometimes we don't get everything. So it'll be, I would expect us to have some match day programs, but I'm not sure how extensive it is. Let's just try a search. Let's just try, my father came from Yarrawonga, so let's see what sort of football stuff we have from the Yarrawonga Pigeons, for example. But it'll be a case-by-case thing. So if you're looking for a particular club, it'll be a matter of looking that club up on our catalogue and seeing what comes up. So this will do a search. It's a very broad search. Okay, we've got a history of the Yarrawonga Pigeons, and a couple of photos, but it doesn't look like we received any of their programs, but they might come under the league. And I think that was the Ovens and Murray League. So let's just go Ovens, Murray League and see if anything comes up there. Again, look, it's not looking all that good, unfortunately. So it may be one of those things that we sporadically have material, but we don't have comprehensive material. And I think if you're looking for a particular club, do a bit of a search for that club on our catalogue. The other thing to do would be, as Jones mentioned, Trove, if you're looking for results or players or whatever, the newspapers up to 1955 for that period prior to that would be very good as well, because they often listed the teams and had detail in them that was not dissimilar to what the matchday programs would have had.
And your Footypedia site too, Andrew.
Oh, of course, the Footypedia
Yes.
site. Yeah, that's a good one. I just showed you that and I forgot all about it. So, Jane, there's one there about wants to use an image from the State Library.
Right. Well, it depends, first of all, if the image is in or out of copyright. So we have digitised a lot of our images and they're available for download. So depending on the quality you need, that might need to be reordered. But the first step is to clarify its copyright status and if any other permissions are required. So you're welcome to send us an Ask a Librarian inquiry on that, and someone will certainly get back to you. Okay, so another question that's comes up fairly regularly is about the establishment of Australian rules football, and also the link between the Aboriginal game Mongraal and Australian football. And there's various theories about that. So if you're one of those people interested in that, under the Australian Rules Football Guide, General Histories and Studies, we've got a number of links there. Two of the really interesting ones are the one from William Blandowski way back in the 1850s, his Australia in 142 Images, which is one of the rarest books in the world, in that I think there's only one complete copy at the State Library of Berlin, but it is digitised. And we indicate an important photograph there on page 33, which I won't go to right at the moment because it takes a little bit of getting there. But Blandowski himself was a very interesting guy. He actually was sent up to the Murray region in the 1850s, I think it was the 1850s, around about then, by the Victorian Philosophical Society to study the natural history of the area. And he was pretty eccentric and he didn't like anybody on the Victorian Philosophical Society committee. So when he was studying the fish in the Murray, if he found a particularly ugly fish, he would name it after a member of the committee and give it a description that wasn't dissimilar to the personality of the person he'd named it after. They refused to publish that, so the names didn't stay, but it did create a big furore. But one of the other interesting things he did was he observed the Aboriginals in the area. He did illustrations of their activities and described them. And he described a game that he said was a group of children playing with a ball from a bulrush roots woven together. The ball is neither thrown nor hit with a stick, but kicked by the feet high into the air. The aim of the game is never to let the ball land on the ground. So that sounds a little bit similar. And also there's this one here, which we'll just see, that one might come up fairly quickly, hopefully, which is from another historic account. And you'll see there, he describes it similarly. He says,
The men and boys joyfully assemble when this game is to be played. One makes a ball of opossum skin in the like of good size, somewhat elastic but firm and strong. It is given to the foremost player or someone of mark who is chosen to commence the game. He does not throw it as a white man might do, but drops it and at the same time kicks it with his foot using the instep for that purpose. It is thrown high into the air and there is a rush to secure it. Such a rush is seen commonly at football matches among our own people. The tallest men and those who are able to spring to a great height have the best chance to in this game. So, I mean, as I say, historians are still looking at that and still deciding, arguing about it, but there's great articles there. But those two historic articles of observations are pretty interesting, I think. So let's see whether we've had any further questions. Yeah, I don't know we've had that many there. Jane, did you have any that have come to you of recent times that you might that might be something you could share with people?
Well, I think the exploring the football record is a really great way to get to know about players, and then often it's a good source of information too for family historians because you get pictures of people, a date range, and a full name that can be really helpful to then use to corroborate or add to a piece to a puzzle that you might be missing. As Andrew's mentioned, there's a big crossover between a lot of this information and research for family historians, placing people in a place at a time. And also the fascinating thing which we've all discovered really working on this guide is the world in which football takes place. It's a wonderful way in to explore the past, and so much of our collection can help you do that.
Thanks, Jane. I think we're probably pretty deep into the last quarter here. I think it's into time on, so we might be ready to wind up. So thanks very much for joining us. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things. If you go to our website, the front page, and go to this link here about the library reopening, it's very important to read that because the reopening, while it's fantastic we are reopening, it will be very, very limited. So you need to really read that. The other thing to remember is that we have beautiful buildings and we're very lucky to have those, and it's very unfortunate they've been closed, but we are a library for all Victorians. So we need to be wherever you are, and we do attempt that through our research guides, through the digitising program where we've digitised many hundreds of thousands of our own items. And also we subscribe to vast journal and newspaper collections, as Jane has explained, and they take you into literally millions of articles. So all you have to do to access those in Victoria is click on the Become a Member, and you'll be able to access a vast amount of information just from sitting in your home, which most of us have been doing for the last 2 months. If you happen to be from interstate, your state library will provide that service as well, as does the National Library. The other thing to remember is that we are still working from home on reference questions, and we're more than happy to help you. So if you have any reference or research question that you need a bit of help with or advice on, just click the Ask a Librarian link, and we will then try and give you some information, try and help you in any way that we can. So from Jane and I hope your team does very well this weekend, unless they're playing Carlton or Essendon. And we hope that we all enjoy the start of the season and hope it can continue on and not be broken up again. And as I say, have a bit of a look at our Australian Rules Research Guide. And if you want to catch up with the way football was, have a look at that great games we might have missed, because there's some really interesting stuff in there that we discovered that was really fascinating for us. But for the time being, thanks very much and goodbye for now.
Bye everyone. Thank you.